Thank you for joining us today. I am here with Alison Brown Karabin. Alison was born Alison Serena Brown on March 17, 1974, to Peter and Stephanie Brown in Alexandria, Virginia. Alison grew up in Squirrel Hill with her younger siblings, David and Rachel. She graduated from Taylor Alderdice High School and spent a year in Israel on the Young Judea Year Course program before attending the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Alison graduated with a BA in History and Hebrew and Semitic Studies. After college, she moved to Israel for 5 years, earning her MSW from Yeshiva University's Wutzweiler School of Social Work. She returned to Pittsburgh in 2002 and worked as a geriatric and medical social worker. Alison is married to Josh Karabin, and they are the proud parents of Zachary, age 9. When Alison isn't working for Jewish Residential Services, she can be found trying out new restaurants, walking in Shenley Park, or cooking up a storm. And maybe we can get back to talking restaurants. We're in an unusual time when it's very hard to go to a restaurant, and we're doing a lot more cooking up a storm, I imagine. Alison, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing your grandmother's story.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. My grandmother, Elizabeth Klein Brown, was born on December 13th, 1918 in Ostros, a small rural village in northeast Hungary, near the town of Eger. She was the youngest daughter of Serena and Josef Klein. Elizabeth had a very close relationship with her sister, whose name was Ilona, or Ilonka, as Elizabeth called her, who was 3 years older and lived in another village with her husband and daughter, Veronica. Elizabeth's father, Joseph, was a businessman and landowner. He owned a general store, butcher shop, and vineyards. Later, he became a wine wholesaler. While he was not the biggest landowner in the area, he was the largest taxpayer because of his businesses and land holdings. Serena, her mother, helped out with the store and the running of the household. The family employed a manservant who took care of the horse and buggy and lived with them, and a female helper who worked for the Kleins during the day. Joseph often traveled away from home for work, buying animals to slaughter for his butcher shop and also for his role as a regional councilman. Elizabeth's family was fairly religious. They had to buy kosher meat from the city of Eger, which was about 4 miles away. Ironic that the meat in the shop her father owned was not kosher, so they still had to go somewhere else. My grandmother described her childhood as idyllic. Her parents had a happy marriage, and the family was well integrated into village life. The Kleins were the only Jews in Ostros, and her parents refused to speak Yiddish because they didn't want to raise suspicion or cause friction with their neighbors. My great-grandfather, Joseph, was a veteran of the First World War and was injured in battle. The Hungarian government offered him a pension as a wounded veteran, which he refused because he felt that he was just fulfilling his patriotic duty with his military service. My grandmother, Elizabeth, attended a Catholic primary school. It was the only school in the village, and remarked that the nuns who taught her were sensitive to her religious obligations and did not make her write on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath. She went on to vocational school and was trained as a dental assistant. Elizabeth experienced no anti-Semitism growing up. The regional economy was good, the family had good relations with the people around them, and her father was a very well-respected man. In March 1944, when Elizabeth was 26 years old, the Germans invaded Hungary. She first saw the Germans in Eger, the nearest town. When she saw them, she got on her bicycle and rushed home to her mother, who began to scream and cry. Her father was in Mezhekevesh, about 10 miles away. After that, there was no mail or telephone for Jews. Jews were not allowed to travel, and her father's shop was closed. Jews were not allowed to sell things. The Klein home was the largest in the village, so the Germans occupied it as their headquarters and ordered it to be emptied. Her family, with the help of many villagers, took all the furniture and merchandise from the store and put it in the family's wine cellar. The Kleins were moved to an empty house at the end of the village. They remained there for about 7 or 10 days when they were told to pack a knapsack and were transferred to a ghetto in Mezhekevesh, along with other Jews in the area. In Mezhekevesh, a few streets were emptied and the Jews were locked in. Elizabeth's family occupied one room of a house. It was cramped but livable. They shared the house with her mother's sisters and their families. After about 10 days, they were put on a train to Diosdor on the outskirts of Miskolc, a larger town further to the northeast, and locked in an abandoned brick factory. It was there that Elizabeth was reunited with her sister Ilonka and her niece Veronica. Ilonka's husband had already been sent to forced labor near the Russian front. The conditions in the brick factory were horrible. The Jews were locked in dusty sheds. It was crowded. There was no furniture. People just sat on the dirt floor, and they were not given any food. They only ate what they had brought from the ghetto in Mezhekevesh. It was during the 3 days in that very difficult place that Elizabeth heard her father crying at night for the first time in her life. After 3 days in the brick factory, they were put onto trains. The conditions on the trains were unimaginable. They were locked into cramped cars, no supplies, no facilities. My grandmother remarked that people only had self-control for so long and described the awful feeling of shyness and shame having to urinate and defecate in front of others on the train. The train ride lasted for longer than 2 nights. Elizabeth was with her father, mother, sister, and her child, and her 2 aunts and their families. It was during this train ride that Josef gave Elizabeth advice that would later save her life. Through the slats in the train, he had seen people dressed as prisoners working in the fields. He told her that she should volunteer to work whenever given the opportunity. At the end of the train ride in June 1944, Elizabeth and her family found themselves in Auschwitz. All the new arrivals were separated, men from women, and lined up for selection by Dr. Mengele. Dr. Mengele asked Elizabeth's sister, Ilonka, who the child, Veronica, who she belonged to, because Ilonka was very young looking and he could not believe that she was old enough to be Veronica's mother. Ilonka cried out and clutched onto her daughter. Dr. Mengele hollered at her and then ordered them to go with Elizabeth's mother. Elizabeth's father was sent away with the men. This was the last time that Elizabeth would see her family. Elizabeth was taken with a group of young, healthy Hungarian women to Birkenau, an adjacent camp which was not yet completed. The barracks had no windows, no bunks. They slept on the floor. No heat, no running water or facilities. There were 500 women in her barrack. Upon arrival, they were all given showers, had their hair cut off, and were given clothes and a metal dish for food. My grandmother described the first night at Birkenau as chaotic, with many of the women staying up talking anxiously in the barrack until a guard yelled at them saying, "Do you smell that burning smell? Those are your families." It was silent after that. Shortly after she arrived, Elizabeth was given the opportunity to work. She volunteered to maintain the toilets, latrines, which in reality were 25 wooden boxes with holes cut in them and a bucket below. People who did this work did not stay in the barracks. They were able to sleep in the hospital, which was not really a medical facility, but rather a holding area to take people to the gas chambers. The workers were given an extra set of clothes, and they had the ability to wash themselves after work. The conditions at Birkenau were horrible and very unsanitary. For example, all 500 dishes for the barracks were washed together, and my grandmother said that they came out dirtier afterwards than before they were put in. So Elizabeth and the other workers decided to keep their dishes hidden in the hospital, which was not allowed. They were eventually found out by Dr. Mengele, who hit my grandmother so hard that she fell into one of the toilet boxes. Mengele then decided to make an example of the group in front of all of Birkenau during one of the twice daily lineup and counting of prisoners. He lined Elizabeth's work group up in front of the entire camp and told a German POW, Dr. Schaefer, to give each person 50 lashes. He refused, stating, "I cannot hit a woman." This was a pivotal moment for my grandmother, that somebody could have the courage to say no to such a powerful man. Oddly, that was the end of it, and Dr. Mengele walked away. Elizabeth remained in Birkenau until November 1944, when cold weather set in. They were taken to the sea lager across the street from Birkenau, where the conditions were better. There were windows, bunks, toilets, running water. After 3 days in the sea lager, there was another selection, and Elizabeth, along with about 2,000 women, were given work clothes and bread and put on a regular passenger train. They were taken to a farm in Germany, she thought, to dig anti-tank ditches. It started off well. The work was hard, but the rations were better. The group slept in a barn and had straw and blankets. As the weather grew colder, the work became harder and their clothing proved inadequate. They would stuff straw in their clothes for warmth and use picks to dig ditches that were 5 or 6 meters deep and wide, which were then camouflaged for tanks to roll into. The living conditions grew even poorer when the pump for the well froze and they could no longer clean themselves. Lice were rampant among the prisoners. When the soil was completely frozen, the Germans brought in men from Poland to use dynamite to break up the frozen soil. These men were very hostile to the female prisoners. My grandmother's group worked until the second day of Christmas, when the front began approaching. They started walking on foot with no food on what became known as the Volary Death March. 1,300 Jewish women over the course of 106 days and nights would travel over 550 miles. Because they were given no food, my grandmother and the other prisoners would eat grass, garbage, or whatever they could beg for or steal. Anyone who tried to escape or became too weak or ill to walk was shot. At night, the Germans would lock them up wherever they could. In some areas, the villagers would have sympathy for the women and give them boiled potatoes. Elizabeth once got a hold of a live chicken and was mobbed by a group of the women. They tore it apart and ate it raw. The march seemed to have no purpose and no end. They marched through Dresden twice, once before and once after the bombing. At some point, Elizabeth's feet really began to hurt, but she wouldn't remove her shoes. She explained that shoes equals life. You were never given another pair. If something happened to your shoes, the only option was to wrap your feet in rags, which was inadequate. In the spring of 1945, on a cold May day, the march ended in a small village near the Czech border. The women were put into a yard, and they noticed that there were no guards around. Eventually, the guards came back, the women were lined up and counted, and then the guards disappeared again. This time, they never returned. A couple of days later, they were liberated by the U.S. Army's 2nd Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division. My grandmother recalled feeling goose pimples thinking about it, and how the 2 Jewish chaplains cried like children when they saw us. The women, who had dwindled from 1,300 at the outset of the march, now numbered only 118. They were carried on stretchers to a school that was made into a makeshift hospital. The women were bathed, deloused, and given gowns. In those first few days, another 26 women would die in the hospital. My grandmother, Elizabeth Klein, was the patient in bed number 18. She was diagnosed with emaciation, glossitis, which is a swollen tongue, stomatitis, canker sores in the mouth, edema, dangerous swelling of both of her feet, dehydration, and gangrene. She recalled the strangeness that in the hospital she had to be fed by spoon. She couldn't even lift her arm, but a few days earlier she had been marching. In the hospital, the U.S. Army doctors and medics documented the condition of the group of women. They took pictures of the prisoners, and my grandmother noticed that those people really looked terrible. But when they took her picture, she realized how inhuman she looked. The gangrene in Elizabeth's feet was so bad that the doctors wanted to amputate the lower third of both of her legs. She refused. Eventually, the doctors only took off her little toes and packed her feet with gauze. She remained under the care of the Americans from May 8th to August 4th, 1945, when she returned to Hungary to see if any members of her family had survived the war. Her homecoming was very sad. Almost all of the villagers shunned her. They were ashamed that they had taken her family's belongings. Everything in the wine cellar was gone. A friend from school, her family took her in, and she was able to find 3 jars with gold in them that her father had buried. While she knew the fate of her mother, sister, and niece, Elizabeth had hoped that her father had survived somehow. Sadly, that was not the case. Elizabeth eventually was able to run her family's farm by renting the land to tenant farmers. Her future husband, Paul Brown, had spent 3 years during the war in forced labor near Szianki, Poland. Paul had been a client of her father's, as his family owned a tavern in nearby Mezőkövesd. He came to Ostros to buy wine for his business, and he began to court Elizabeth. My grandparents eventually married in March 1946 in a small civil ceremony with only the mayor and a witness present, stating that at the time, no one was in the mood to have big weddings. Later, they got married by a rabbi in Budapest when my grandmother became pregnant. My father, Peter Joseph Brown, was born in Mezőkövesd on January 5th, 1947. My grandparents realized quickly that they did not want to raise their son in Hungary, a place where there was so much hate. Elizabeth had an aunt, her mother's older sister, named Shari Ungar, who lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They made up their mind to move to America. Moving to America was not simple, though. My grandparents and father left Hungary in December 1948 with an immigration visa to Chile. That was the only country for which they were able to obtain a visa, and you had to have a visa to get a Hungarian passport to leave the country. So they traveled to Zurich, Switzerland, where they believed they would be able to get a visa for the United States. Their connection in Zurich fell through, and they found themselves stuck in Paris for over 2 years. My family had lost their refugee status when they returned to Hungary after the war to search for remaining family members. They could not work in Paris as they were in transit and had no legal status in France. They had to check in with the police each month and prove that they were not earning money. Their time in Paris was a desperate one. My grandparents made multiple attempts to obtain U.S. immigration papers and were denied every time. At this point, Paul and Elizabeth were both very depressed and later remarked that they would have contemplated suicide if it wasn't for their young son, Peter, my father. Elizabeth decided to write a letter in Hungarian, which she took to the Berlitz School in Paris to be translated into English. In her letter, Elizabeth explained their determination to get away from the new communist government in Hungary and summarized their 27 frustrating and disappointing months in Paris. She also enclosed a photograph of little Peter and wrote, "This is why we must come to America." She sent the letter off to President Truman. A short time later, they received a letter from the president's cabinet telling them that the U.S. Embassy in Paris would contact them. A few days later, they were inside the U.S. Embassy and asked, "How soon will you be able to leave?" To which they replied, "We can fit everything we own in 2 shopping bags." Less than a week later, they boarded the French ship Liberty, bound for America. They arrived in New York on February 5th, 1951, and were met by Elizabeth's aunt's husband, who vouched for them with the immigration department, stating that he would accept responsibility for their support and they would not be a burden on the government. When they arrived in Pittsburgh, my grandfather got a job relatively quickly at Rosenblum's Bakery on Murray Avenue. He worked there until he retired 35 years later, starting off as a baker's helper and working his way up to bread baker and union member. While I think it must have been difficult for my grandfather to go from a successful businessman in Hungary to a baker's assistant, he always seemed to enjoy his work. Rosenblum's employed a number of Hungarians, and he felt at home there. The transition to life in Pittsburgh was more difficult for my grandmother. She likely suffered from what we now know as PTSD, and her relationship with her aunt was strained. The only work Elizabeth could find was as a seamstress, which she hated. She worked as a seamstress for 7 years until she got the courage to speak to a crossing guard that she passed each day on her way to work. She really envied the crossing guard, who worked outdoors, had a smart uniform, and got to work with children. The crossing guard told her a little bit about the job and how to apply at the city-county building downtown. At the time, crossing guards were part of the Pittsburgh police force, and there was a height minimum of 5 feet. My grandmother, who was 4'10" on her best day, wore her highest heeled boots for her interview. She got the job and worked doing what she loved for 27 years, crossing children at Forbes and Whiteman, Colfax School, St. Philomena's, and later at Sterrett School. My father, Peter Brown, grew up to be a very dutiful son. He got good grades in school and graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a degree in architecture. Peter had an ROTC scholarship at CMU and served in the Corps of Engineers at Fort Belvoir in Northern Virginia. He was a captain when he was discharged from the Army. For my father, the Army was a means to an end, an education and obligatory service during the end of the Vietnam War. But for my grandparents, his service as an officer in the U.S. Army was a point of great pride. Like many new immigrants, my grandparents were very patriotic and felt a great debt of gratitude to their new homeland. In college, Peter met a lovely CMU student named Stephanie Gross. They married in 1971 and moved to Virginia, where my dad was stationed. After I was born, we moved back to Pittsburgh, and the family grew to include my brother David and my sister Rachel. We were always very close with my grandparents. We grandkids spent a lot of time in their house, often eating dinners on a weeknight or visiting on Friday nights after dinner when they hosted their Hungarian friends over for cards, coffee, and cake. The men would play cards in the kitchen, and the women would gossip and smoke cigarettes in the dining room. There was always a strong aroma of coffee from the kitchen percolator and my grandmother's coffee cakes. We kids would roam from room to room, having our cheeks pinched and understanding little, as the language spoken was Hungarian. As a child, I asked my grandparents to teach me Hungarian, and they refused. My grandfather told me that we were Americans and we would speak English. That said, his English was pretty poor, and he would lapse into Hungarian after a few sentences and need to be reminded to speak English, please. My grandparents' social circle was all Hungarian survivors and refugees. They were a tight-knit group, each filling in for the family that they had lost, sharing in both celebrations and sadness. In Hungarian, it's polite to call all older people neni or auntie or bocsi or for uncle. I think I might have been a teenager before I realized that I was not actually related to any of these people. My grandparents, particularly my grandmother, began to talk with me about the Holocaust when I was about 12 years old. She never spoke with my father about it. She felt he was too sensitive. She said that she felt guilty about my father being a sad child because of the hopeless and sad years in Paris. Years later, I would talk about this with my father, who admitted that he knew things but didn't want to burden my grandparents by asking. My grandparents were wonderful people. They showered us with love and affection. It is often hard for me to imagine surviving what they did and coming out as positive and happy as they were. My grandmother loved playing cards, gardening, a good cup of coffee, and a cigarette. As they got older, they moved from their house in Point Breeze, which had a large garden, to an apartment in Squirrel Hill. My grandmother really missed her garden, and she was notorious for walking around the neighborhood with a pair of scissors in her purse. If she saw pretty flowers in someone's front yard, she would snip a few to take home. Up until her last few years, she was pretty spry, thanks to her regimen of water aerobics at the JCC, and she could outrun most homeowners that came after her. Those that she couldn't outrun, she could charm with her twinkly blue eyes and thick Hungarian accent. My grandmother, Elizabeth Klein Brown, passed away in December 2016 at age 98.
Alison, I was lucky enough to know your grandmother, and I love the stories that you have about growing up with her and with your grandfather. And one thing that strikes me right now, there are so many things that you just said that we could follow up on. But one thing that's striking to me that will be interesting to anyone who watches this is that the pattern in your family where your grandmother didn't want to burden your father, but talk to you about it, repeats in other families of Holocaust survivors, where the children rarely heard directly from the parents what they experienced in the Holocaust, but maybe the oldest grandchild gets to hear all of it. So what was that like for you?
I mean, it felt like a secret that I had that other people maybe didn't know about or didn't happen in their family. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up who came from families of Holocaust survivors. And I guess I thought it was just something that made me different. When I was in college, I studied abroad at Haifa University for a semester, and I took a course about the Holocaust, the effect of the Holocaust on Israeli society. And I learned about how survivors rarely talk to the second generation, they talk to their grandchildren. And that was really powerful for me because I realized it wasn't just me who had this experience, and that there were other people who had similar relationships. And it was also during that time that I began to email with my dad about what it was like to grow up with my grandparents as parents. Wow. And it wasn't a conversation that I was really able to have face-to-face, but over email, thousands of miles away, we had a really interesting dialogue about that, and I'm glad I had that opportunity.
That is really incredible. And I'm just wondering where you draw your strength to tell this story.
That's a tough one, because it is hard. I mean, it's something I've known all my adult life, and from when I was a teenager, but it isn't easy to tell the story of my family. But I think it's really important to speak about it. My grandmother really didn't speak publicly about her experience. She was very self-conscious about her accent, and she didn't like public speaking. She did make some recordings, but she didn't speak to school students. And through the Holocaust Center, I've spoken to a number of groups of students, also church members and other interested individuals. And I have to say the questions and answers after speaking really sort of re-energized me. And it makes me feel good to know that people are interested in learning about the Holocaust, and meeting, especially the students. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, what do you want them to take away from hearing the story?
Well, that it's real, and that it's a real family, and it's someone in Pittsburgh like them. Even if they themselves haven't met a Holocaust survivor or even a Jewish person, I think it's important for them to have that connection. But I think also, especially in today's political and social climate, I think it's really important to talk about anti-Semitism and, the dangers of not learning from our history, because there's a lot of things playing out today with other groups that Jews have experienced historically. So I think it's really important to continue sharing the experience with groups.
I want to share one memory I have of your grandmother, if you don't mind. And
Sure.
You mentioned that she was too short, really, to have her crossing guard job. And she was a really tiny woman. I'm not so tall myself, but she was much, much smaller than me. When we opened the Holocaust Center in our Greenfield location, we had a big opening with an exhibit that she was part of called In Celebration of Life. And we'll make sure to share those photographs of her. She was so lovely and she had such sweetness, but she was also a little bit mischievous, I would say. I mean, she really had a spark. So she came to the opening and she brought with her maps. So this is where it gets very serious. She brought with her maps of that death march that we know of as the Volary Death March. And she said, I have maps. And I said, with you? I mean, there were 300 people packed in like sardines in the space. Like, what am I going to do with archival historical maps? But I want to really talk about that event because of what she experienced and withstood and survived. And this is a story, the story of that death march is fairly well known to students because Gerda Weissman Klein was on that march and wrote about it. And I discovered, this is another thing we can share. I discovered last year that Yad Vashem has done further research about that march and about the women who were on it and survived it. So I will share all of that too. But that many days in the winter, marching over 500 miles. And you talked about her keeping her shoes and how important that was. She still almost lost her legs, even though she had on shoes. So everybody listening knows what it meant if you lost your shoes. You didn't survive. So I find, to me, the incredible thought of your grandmother as a young woman surviving that horrific experience and going on to be this sweetheart who loved to work with children and was a crossing guard. Just what a legacy for you. Really.
It is pretty amazing. I don't know where she and my grandfather grew strength from, but I think they had each other and they had survived something so terrible that I guess it was only up from there. Yeah.
This is what survivors' stories, and now through our generation speakers, we keep this alive. This is what we bring, and what you bring to students and to the community and beyond is this example of incredible resilience and strength and, the ability to make something positive coming out of just a real horror and still persisting and building a life. It's very moving. It's incredible. I'm really blown away by the story. You tell it so beautifully, Alison.
Oh, thank you.
You do. So did your grandparents, you said your grandmother didn't like to talk about it so much and didn't really want to talk in public. Did your grandfather talk about his experience?
Very, very little. My grandfather, as I sort of mentioned, my grandfather's English was never that good. So it's kind of funny to think about now that we didn't really have a solid common language. But you don't really need that with your grandparents, I don't think. But I remember occasionally he would tell me stories about people being shot and the hard work that they had to do. And I don't really know specifics about where he was in forced labor beyond what my grandmother had mentioned. But it was kind of weird to have your grandfather sort of mention these things sort of unrelated to anything else. But I think he needed to talk to someone about it. And I was there and he trusted me. So in a way, I felt honored that he would talk to me about those things. But it was very limited.
So when you decided to tell your grandmother's story, did you have to do research? Did you have to piece it together anywhere?
Yeah, so a number of years ago, I think in the late 1990s, my grandmother did a video for the Shoah Foundation, and I have a copy of it on videotape. But my brother, who is a world cultures teacher, he had them converted to like a digital file. So I was able to watch that. And I knew a lot of I knew a lot of the story, but I didn't know the details like dates and times. So I did use her recordings. I did some historical research just to find out when certain things happened. And actually, you mentioned Yad Vashem and the Volary Death March. I did use Yad Vashem's website to get information about that because I didn't really know. I had read All About My Life by Gerda Weissman Klein, but it was a long time ago and I couldn't remember all the details. But Yad Vashem really has some very powerful videos of people who survived.
Definitely. I want to pivot a little bit now to think more about what's happening in the world today, and specifically in our country, where systemic racism has been an ongoing problem going back 400 years. And we've seen so many protests since the end of May. And I'm wondering if you take lessons from the Holocaust for how we can address systemic racism in this country and how we can combat all forms of prejudice now.
I mean, certainly I can draw connections and inspiration. I think, especially with the protests recently from the Black Lives Matter group, I think the idea of seeing people as less than human is an extremely dangerous thing. And I think we're seeing that in the United States with the murder of Black people, especially Black men, at the hands of police officers. And I feel like Jews in Europe had a similar experience of being treated as an other and as inhuman and dirty and carrying diseases. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, looking at today's Black Lives Matter and other movements that are going on. I think it's a little, I think Jewish people should make those connections, but I think we have the privilege of sort of being white or passing for white in American society for the most part. So it's not like someone who is a person of color who you can see that when you meet them. I mean, Jews joke about having, Jewish hair or whatever, but really we can pass as sort of the dominant culture. But not all Jews in the world are Ashkenazi. And I think, some people, partisans and other groups, resistance groups, stood up for Jews in Europe. And I think we need to do the same thing today. I mean, we have the political power and the standing in society to really lend our voices. And I do, and I hope that other people do.
It's definitely what we aspire to do as the Holocaust Center. I think so too, that we have an opportunity to use what we know, and for, as the Holocaust Center, use that platform to really speak up for people who are being targeted, who are being mistreated, who are still suffering from historic wrongs that persist in our day. And there's one more thing I want to pull out from your story of your grandmother, although I made a very long list while you were speaking, but it's the story of the one man at Auschwitz who wouldn't beat the women, that he resisted the orders from Dr. Mengele. And it's stories like that tell us the risk was not maybe as great as we think, that it was possible to resist Nazi authority, and that it's possible to resist these kinds of undercurrents that we still have in our society.
Yeah, I think for my grandmother, when that happened, it must have been terrifying. But she said when she told me about it, that it also gave her confidence in humanity and that people, even in the worst conditions, still could have humanity. And it's funny in our modern day and age, the expression I won't hit a woman sounds sexist, but I think given the context of the 1940s, I think it was really incredible what that man was able to do. And it's also incredible that Dr. Mengele didn't do anything in response to that. And I don't know why, and my grandmother never knew why, but it made a big impact on her, and I think helped her to carry on.
When we talk about bystanders, and we talk about how a lot of people are uncomfortable with seeing any kind of mistreatment of another person, but maybe don't say anything for a variety of reasons. But if one person speaks up, then it empowers everyone else to speak up.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I take from these historic examples real inspiration for how we can behave now. And for the students that you talk to, same goes. And they get to hear it from your grandmother's experience. So what a gift that is, Alison. It's wonderful. So is there anything we didn't talk about that you have on your mind that you'd like to mention?
I mean, I'm a social worker by profession, and I think the things that my grandmother experienced when they got to Pittsburgh, probably because of her experience in the war, really had kept her from being able to get jobs that she wanted. It strained the relationship with her aunt. And I think it was years until we knew what post-traumatic stress disorder was. And really, it was only after the Vietnam War that it became studied broadly. But I think there's a lot of mental health issues with Holocaust survivors and with their children, and sort of patterns that go on through generations with generational trauma. And I think it's important to learn about that, as well as the events of the Holocaust, because I think some of those repercussions we're still feeling today because of that. And really, I think in that time, mental health was not something that was talked about at all. So I don't think my grandmother could have gotten services at the time, but I would hope that today we've moved past that, and that post-traumatic stress disorder is something that people talk openly about.
I hope so. I mean, I think there's still a stigma. And I mean, you're the professional in this area, but I worry, especially at a time like this when we're all also dealing with the pandemic, that some people are really struggling and maybe are not getting the care that they need.
Yeah, I mean, especially when we're all sort of stuck in our homes. But I think people are speaking out more today. I think celebrities, I mean, as superficial as it sounds, but I think celebrities are speaking openly about mental health issues. And going back to the American military, the Vietnam War led to a lot of interest in post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the effects of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have led to a lot of research about PTSD and treatment modalities. So I think that some of those things, the US military, Veterans Affairs, and celebrities kind of help to normalize it a little bit. But it still is very taboo. And I think in the Jewish community especially, and I don't know why, but I think that mental health is a difficult thing to talk about, but we all talk about spraining our knee or, our cholesterol count. So I think mental health should be in the same category.
That's such an important message. And we feel that way too. It's part of seeing people as human and knowing our own humanity is to understand that, I think so too, that this is on par with a physical injury or a, like a physical treatment need, that we need to, when we see each other, I think we understand these struggles and we're open to addressing them, making sure that people have access to the care that they need and that it's culturally appropriate care is another thing that has come out a lot after the summer of protests. And that's something else that we care about as the Holocaust Center, especially because of the legacy of trauma among Holocaust survivors and also among liberators. That this is something that comes down through the generations. And I think that we have a positive contribution to make to this conversation. And you have definitely done that today, Alison. Like I said, I'm so grateful to you. This was a really moving and important conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.